Welcome to Karl's Chronicles. I'm glad you can join us. This time here, I thought maybe we would actually start on the book of Revelation. The last time we talked a little bit about Ezekiel. I'm still working on getting the studio set up, getting better audio, maybe even some better backdrops and things. But it's all bits and pieces each week. But I want to kind of get something started. And I thought we would start with the book of Revelation. It's going to be probably a long haul, considering these are short videos. And the short videos are going to have to pile up if we're going to do any kind of learning. Some of the books that we'll be referring to, for instance, is the Hans Loranda. I'm looking at my video here, and this is all backwards. And I'm just wondering if that's what. Hans Lorandel, How to Understand the End Time Prophecies of the Bible. That would be one. And the one that really was the basis of my study that I used, it wasn't the one that it's not that you have to believe everything in it, but you use it as a guide. This is the central outline that I would follow in my study, using other sources and to kind of keep me on track. And this is Ranko Stevanovich's book, Revelation of Jesus Christ. You can get this at your local ABC. Sandy will have a copy for you. You can order it from Andrews University Press. You can go online to Amazon and get it. You'll probably get a used copy. This is the second edition that I showed you. You might find a first edition available. That would be pretty cheap if you can get one there. I would say pick that up, unless you want to spend the money on the new one or the second edition. It's going to be helpful. If the commentary might be too much for you, Ranko did the book Plain Revelation. Plain Revelation, as some call it, the Bible study, might be more for a general readership, but it's not going to allow you to develop the kinds of questions and stuff you might want to with the commentary. But that's a good place to start. Start there if you need to, and then advance to the commentary. But as you study the book, remember to ask questions, formulate the question. Sometimes the best you can hope for is a well-formed question. You may not get an answer right away. You may not get an answer for years. But we have to begin with questions. And so that's where we want to start to study. My experience with the book of Revelation began in 2013. My experience began with it probably back in 1969-70. I was a young boy up until about freshman in high school. I was reading Uriah Smith and the general literature that the church had on the time, and that most people was reading. And I had problems with how we, as a denomination, looked at the seven trumpets and the seven plagues. I was never fully satisfied with how we understood those, and it took decades for me to finally come to terms with that. And in this study that began in January 2013, I began to answer those questions. The number one problem in the book of Revelation that I found was understanding a coherent structure, a full pattern, a coherent story from Revelation 1 down to Revelation 22. And normally our evangelists would present bits and pieces, and we would have a hard time hanging the whole story together. And this is how we were fed the story. And so we have an disconnect between what's going on in the book of Revelation. And so during the current pandemic, I had people calling me or texting me asking, is this the sixth plague? Or is this one of the six plagues? I don't think we would be asking those questions if we had done a coherent study, textual study of the book of Revelation. But instead, we've done a lot of proof texting, and we've done a lot of prophesying or interpreting Revelation from the headlines. And so anytime something new happens, we run immediately to the book of Revelation, try to plug it in, make it part of it. We've been doing this for 100, 150 years. I have books in my library. I look at it now and smile because it's really corny how some of that stuff would reflect in today's world and how serious they took it back in the day. Flying, for instance, the airplane. The fact that we finally took to the air, mankind's first attempt. Here we are in the early 1900s, a book published circa 1920. We hadn't even been hardly in the air 15 years. I mean, the Wright brothers took to flight, circa 1903? And they're showing these biplanes, paper kites, flying around as if this is a cutting edge technology. And this is what's going to bring about the end of the world. We can't do prophecy from the headlines. We can't just string a bunch of text together and try to predict what's going to happen. In fact, Revelation is not about that at all. Not about predicting the future. But it's about telling the story about what God is doing to restore all things. So we need to understand the story before we start understanding the pieces, what they mean, how to interpret them. And that's what I want us to get into. So, again, my study began in 2013. I took my small group, Friday night group, through it in about a year and a half. And I didn't preach on it for about 8 months before I first preached on it there at the Mesa Church. And I wanted to, it wasn't just a Bible study to prepare for a sermon. It was to really understand the book of Revelation, what was going on. And I found the key to it is the sanctuary. For those interested in the sanctuary, you'll find that very interesting, that the sanctuary will help you unlock the meaning and story of the book of Revelation. Some of the questions we have is considering like authorship. Some people have looked at different John being the author, not the Apostle John, the disciple of Christ. But some others are saying that the same John could not be the author of both the gospel and the Revelation. But I believe that it is John the Apostle, the disciple of Christ, who wrote the book of Revelation. I believe that it took place in the late first century, around 95 to 98 AD. That makes more sense. Most of the church fathers who write about it place it at that time, and so I have no problem with that. You find that those who place it earlier, around say 68 AD, placed it around the time of Caesar Nero, and most of those views come from what's called preterism, or higher criticism. The views are not major in that sense among the studies. We're going to use the historicist approach to this book. We understand that prophecy unfolds across history, beginning from the time of the writer until the consummation. John would be from the first century to the consummation. Daniel would be from the 6th century BC to the consummation. So that's the historicism. As it unfolds through history, the prophecy takes us to the completion. The other basic form, preterism, says it all took place back at the beginning, that there was written more for localized time and events, and that's where it has its meaning, and that we can apply it later on spiritually. And I have a problem with that. I don't think that was what the writer was writing about. He was writing about a real consummation. The other is futurism. Futurism was systemized and put together in a volume by Francisco Ribera, 1590, a Spanish Jesuit. And in through that, he says that the prophecies dealing in the end take place largely at the end of time, just before the second coming, in the future, hence futurism. They denounce the year-day principle, and they say outright that the Pope is not Antichrist. So those are the three bases of futurism. Futurism was adjusted. Modern-day futurism is largely dispensational, and that was coming out of 1830. John Nelson Darby, who had developed a system of dispensationalism that incorporated the futuristic approach to prophecy. But dispensationalism itself is not just a hermeneutic about the end time. It really is a hermeneutic or a theology about the covenants. It says that God has an earthly people, the Jews. He has a heavenly people, the church, and the two shall never meet. Hence, God treats them separately. That's why when they teach about the second coming, they teach the rapture separate from the church, because the church has to be raptured out in order for God to begin dealing with the Jews. And so they can't meet. So now you have two comings. You have the coming in secret to rapture the church, and then the coming in glory, where God comes to set up his kingdom for 1,000 years. That kingdom is usually looked at as an earthly, temporal kingdom that lasts 1,000 years. In that kingdom, usually you're going to still have people making decisions, and you're going to have death. So it's very interesting how that's interpreted. But after the 1,000 years is when God sets up the new kingdom. Most people, even evangelicals, think, when you accept Christ, when you die, you go to heaven and live forever. And that's not so. The new earth is our home, not heaven, the earth. I know we sing the song, well, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through it. But this world is our home. Maybe not in the way it is, the condition that it's in, but it's our home. God will recreate it, new earth, bring down the new city, and restore all things. And we'll live on this earth as three-dimensional physical beings, not as spiritual ghosties. That's the long-term plan. So it's not just going to heaven living forever as ghosts, as people, most evangelicals view it. The authorship, I believe, as I said, was John the Apostle. I believe it was written late first century. I believe it was written in preparation for the second advent. John tells us at the beginning in verse 1 that the book was written in such a way to be symbolic. He tells us there, I'm reading out New King James, chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. And signified is the word. Signified comes from the Greek word for symbol. Revelation was written in symbols about real things, but yet in symbols. Normally when we read scripture, we read it real as it reads, literally, unless or until it denotes something symbolic or spiritualized or whatever. Revelation seems to be the opposite. We read it in the context of symbolism, unless or otherwise it suggests literal. In reading scripture, I don't generally like the term literal. The reason why is that's not a problem in and of itself, but in the face of dispensationalism, I don't particularly care for it because it suggests the ultra-literalism of dispensationalism that reads scripture literally. When it says that the sixth bowl was poured upon the river Euphrates and it dried up, they mean literally the river Euphrates dries up. That's ultra-literal. That's not what we mean when we talk about reading scripture literally. I don't want you to be confused with that. You read scripture as it reads. If you're reading history, it's history. You're reading apocalyptic, it's apocalyptic. You read it as it reads. We do that with anything else. Common sense should prevail as we study the scriptures. Scripture has basically primarily one meaning. We can make other applications, but it has primarily one interpretation. We should be careful not to go beyond scripture. It's easy to do. Sometimes we do it, but we need to guard against that. Don't try to add more to it than what it says. Let scripture take care of itself. And so, looking at the book, preparing for its reading, I want us to consider some basic approaches. One is reading it as symbolism. Secondly, understand that when John wrote this, he's using the language of the past to write about the present and the future. That means he's largely taken the Old Testament stories and hanging his story, component, like a lattice work, and to tell his story. The uh, Old Testament is not just the thing he uses, but the more we know the Old Testament, the better we're going to know John's message to us. But he also uses other literature such as the pseudepigrapha, writings under other names, um, the apocrypha, the hidden books, uh, even the other culture, the pagan culture. He might use things, but primarily he's using the Old Testament, and so that helps us. The more we know about the Old Testament, the more we're going to understand John's story. And as I said earlier, that story is hung on, or the key to unlocking it is the sanctuary. Part of our study is going to take us through the structure and show us a coherent picture of the book. And as we begin to understand its themes and its story, we can begin to ask the questions in context and relevance to what these things mean. And we're not just running to the current headlines of the newspaper, etc., to try to find out what they mean, to plug them back into Scripture. We don't want to do that. We want to do what's called a textual approach. We want to take it from the text, let it explain itself. And that's using certain procedures that we'll practice as we continue this presentation. So as each presentation goes along, we'll talk about those different things and how the book of Revelation is broke up in parts, and how those parts together tell the overarching story about what God is doing to restore all things, to bring things back together. So that's our most important part that I want to get across today. There's a coherent story to be found. There's a coherent understanding of the book that maybe you have never known, and I hope to be able to show you. A story about God's love and what he's doing to put all things right. It's not a book to be feared. As George Knight writes about, it's not about dragons, beasts, and things falling out of the sky. That's the backstory. It is a story about what God is doing to restore things. It is a story about God's love. And even the atheist in the world is complaining about where was God when such and such happened, and this happened, and that happened. How could he be a just God? It's a question of what's called theodicy. Theodicy is just a fancy word. Theos and decay, just the justice of God is what it means. Where was God's justice? And they're looking for a theodicy. They're looking for a way to understand how God could be just in an unjust world. And what we're seeing here in Revelation is how God's dealing with that, and how he's going to restore the world, restore justice. So that's part of the journey, and I hope you'll join me on that. And in the end there, we can have better preparation. You'll have these parts being smaller, maybe you'll be able to internalize them better, have a better understanding of each part, be able to ask questions that maybe you weren't thinking of before. And also in studying the book, John Pauline did a book called Deep Things of God. It should be available at the ABC still. Deep Things of God was largely based off his dissertation, which was on the seven seals, which was largely on the first four seals. I'm sorry, trumpets, which largely based on the first four trumpets. But really was more not about the trumpets themselves, but about how to study them, how to look at the trumpets. And so the Deep Things of God was really more of a reader book for general reading, to help you understand how to look at apocalyptic literature, how to interpret it, how to handle it. If that's a little much for you, I use that book for putting together an introduction to my seminar on Revelation, and you're welcome to it. My email's at the end. Send me an email. I'll send you a copy of that, and then kind of give you a quick overview of some of the ways in which you need to approach the book of Revelation. And then you can maybe go to the Deep Things of God and have something to kind of anchor that in when you pick that book up and not get lost in it. But either way, check that out. You can check out the book, Deep Things of God. I don't have a copy with me to show you. You can order that from your ABC. Sandy'd be happy to have that order. You can check online at Amazon, buy them used and new, wherever you can get it. You'll find that be very helpful. And I also recommend be prepared to do some outlining. of the book of Revelation. I know you might say, I don't like outlining, that's too much work, and I'm not going to do it, and that's fine, don't do it. But you're not going to benefit as much. And you're only going to benefit from the work you put into it. You can't just sit and listen to me and get spoon fed. You've got to actually do the work. And you'll find that you'll begin to develop a better understanding of Revelation. And you too will have an entirely different experience. An experience, by the way, worth sharing. God raised this church up, I believe, just as certainly as he raised up Martin Luther with the gospel and the Reformation. He raised us up to give the last message to the world. You read in Revelation 14, the three angels' messages, verses 6 to 12. After that is the second coming. That means there's nothing else after the three angels' message. He raised us up to give that message. And if we're going to give that message, we need to give it in clarity with understanding to prepare for the second coming of Christ, to enlarge the kingdom. The book of Revelation, that study, is going to help us do that in the right way. So I hope you'll join me on that and be blessed by it. So thanks for stopping by. We'll see you on the next episode. God bless.